Welcome to Lingotales, where we will live the story and learn the language. What if help entered a life under cover of darkness, leaving no name, no bargain, and no explanation, only a transformed morning? Today we turn to the Elves and the Shoemaker, a cherished old fairy tale about a poor but upright craftsman and the wife who shares both his hardship and his hope. Their world is a small winter town of narrow lanes, lit windows, and long evenings measured by candle flame. Their shop is nearly bare, their money almost spent, and one final piece of leather remains. Yet the shoemaker still honors his craft, because careful work has dignity even when fortune does not notice. In this story, secret kindness restores possibility, gratitude takes practical form, and a humble workshop becomes the threshold where wonder quietly enters. The poor shoemaker sat at his small workbench in the candlelit shop, surrounded by shelves that had grown almost bare. Outside, the town's narrow lanes lay hushed, but inside, worry seemed to gather in every shadowed corner. He and his wife were honest, tender-hearted people who had always worked with patience and care. Still, the world had changed around them. Wealthier families bought from larger merchants, while poorer families mended old shoes until little was left to mend. Though he labored from morning until night, his coins dwindled and his hopes wore thin. The shoemaker opened his small leather box and found a single piece of smooth brown leather inside. It was fine material, strong and supple, but there was only enough for one last pair of shoes. His wife stood beside him in silence, needing no explanation. If that final pair failed to sell, the shop would have no leather, no orders, and no path forward. The shoemaker held the piece for a long, quiet moment. Then, without complaint or self-pity, he carried it to the bench and prepared to work. The tired shoemaker measured the leather, cut it with practiced precision, and arranged the pieces in careful order on his workbench. His hands were weary, and the candle flame trembled as though it too had reached the edge of its strength. His wife laid a gentle hand on his shoulder, reminding him that morning eyes would serve the work better than exhausted ones. So he covered the leather with a clean cloth. After his evening prayer, he closed the quiet shop and went upstairs to rest beside her. Moonlight poured through the small workshop window and silvered the shoemaker's tools. The awl, thread, tiny nails, and polished wooden lasts lay exactly where his careful hands had placed them. Above the shop, he and his wife slept, worn down by the slow pressure of worry and labor. Outside, the town rested beneath a winter sky bright with stars. Nothing stirred in the narrow lanes. Yet below, in the stillness of the little shop, the familiar tools waited, and the impossible was drawing near. At dawn, the shoemaker descended to the workroom, ready to thread his needle and begin the final pair of shoes. The moment he stepped into the shop, he stopped in the doorway. On the bench, precisely where the cut leather had lain, stood a finished pair of shoes. He rubbed his eyes, half believing that sleep still clung to him. Then he bent closer. The shoes were real, graceful, strong, and polished to a finish so exquisite that in all his years he had never seen finer workmanship. The shoemaker called his wife, and she came quickly, fearing some new misfortune. Instead, she found him standing before the most beautiful shoes either of them had ever seen. Her hands pressed together in astonishment. They looked at the shoes, then at one another, then around the small room. The door remained locked, the windows fastened, and nothing had been taken. Only the leather had changed. Somehow, in the secrecy of night, unseen hands had turned their last fragile hope into a masterpiece. A well-dressed customer entered the shop before the couple had time to untangle the mystery. His keen eyes went immediately to the new shoes, and he asked to see them. The shoemaker handed them over with hands that trembled despite his effort to steady them. The customer turned the shoes, examined the even stitches, pressed the firm soles, and smiled with unmistakable approval. They were, he said, the finest shoes he had seen in many months. Then he paid more than the shoemaker would have dared to request. That evening, the shoemaker arranged leather pieces for 2 pairs of shoes on the clean workbench. From the customer's generous payment, he had bought new leather as well as bread, butter, and soup for supper. The house seemed warmer, as though relief itself had entered with the meal. Yet he treated the blessing with care rather than excitement. He cut each piece precisely, laid everything beneath the cloth, and went to bed with a heart less burdened than before. Downstairs, moonlight kept its silent watch over the tools. The next morning, the shoemaker came down and found 2 finished pairs of shoes waiting on the bench. The cut leather had vanished, replaced by work even more refined than before. One pair was sturdy yet elegant, made for a gentleman crossing long city streets. The other was softer and lighter, suited to a lady who wanted grace in every step. The shoemaker lifted them as though he were holding treasure. Beside him, his wife laughed softly, caught between joy and disbelief. Before long, customers crowded into the little shop, drawn by the beauty of the shoes. Both pairs sold that very day, and the shoemaker bought leather for 4 more. Night after night, he cut the pieces and left them on the bench. Morning after morning, perfect shoes appeared. The story of his workmanship spread through the town and beyond. People came for strong boots, dancing slippers, wedding shoes, and sturdy shoes for rain and snow. The shoemaker received every order humbly, grateful for a mystery he still could not explain. The shoemaker's wife placed fresh bread near a steady little hearth, while the shop shelves filled with leather, polish, and finished shoes. The bare corners no longer held the same cold emptiness. The cracked window was repaired, and the rooms carried the comforting sense of warm soup, clean leather, and useful labor. Their clothes remained plain, but they were washed and mended. After so many months of strain, their faces softened. The mystery remained unresolved, but hunger and fear no longer had places at their table. On a snowy evening, the shoemaker and his wife sat beside the fire while the shop below rested in silence. Snow tapped lightly against the window, steady and patient. The shoemaker, thoughtful and subdued, said that someone had helped them in a way they did not understand. Whoever came by night had rescued them from hunger and despair. His wife nodded, for the same feeling had been growing in her. They could not continue receiving such kindness without at least trying to learn who had given it. That evening, the shoemaker and his wife hid behind a curtain in the corner of the workshop. On the bench, the cut leather waited as usual, laid neatly in the thin wash of moonlight. They put out the lamp and remained still. Darkness deepened around the room. The town clock struck 11, and later midnight. Cold crept around their feet, but neither of them moved or spoke. Every faint sound seemed magnified, and both kept their wide, expectant eyes fixed on the bench. 2 tiny elves slipped through the moonlit workshop window, just as the last note of midnight faded. They were no taller than children's dolls, quick and light as sparks leaping from a fire. Their faces shone with life, and their movements were eager and bright. Yet the shoemaker's wife noticed at once the sorrow hidden in the sight. They wore almost nothing. Their little bodies were bare against the winter cold, and their swift feet had no shoes. Even so, they hurried straight to the bench, ready for work. The tiny elves climbed onto the workbench and began stitching the leather with astonishing skill. One drew thread through the needle, while the other shaped leather around a polished wooden last. Their hands moved so swiftly that the shoemaker could hardly follow the pattern of their work. They stitched, tapped, trimmed, turned, polished, and finished each shoe with joyful exactness. They did not quarrel, hesitate, or waste emotion. Together, they seemed to dance through the craft, filling the silent room with a happiness beyond speech. After the elves vanished, the shoemaker and his wife stepped slowly from behind the curtain. The finished shoes stood on the bench, flawless as ever, but now the mystery had faces, hands, and bare feet. The shoemaker's eyes filled with tears. His wife looked toward the place where the little helpers had disappeared, and gratitude rose in her heart, yet sorrow rose with it. Those generous elves had worked for them night after night in the cold, without warm clothing and without shoes of their own. The shoemaker's wife held fine, warm cloth in her hands, while the shoemaker selected the softest leather in the shop. That morning, after the shoes were sold, they decided that gratitude must become action. The elves had helped them when they were nearly empty-handed. Now the shop was warm, the shelves were full, and their lives had regained comfort and steadiness. They would prepare no leather for sale that day. Instead, they would make gifts for the secret friends who had saved them. The couple worked at the table, making gifts small enough for the elves. The shoemaker's wife cut tiny shirts, coats, and trousers from warm cloth. She stitched neat seams, added little buttons, and shaped careful cuffs and collars with patient fingers. The shoemaker made 2 tiny pairs of shoes from soft leather, sewing them with particular tenderness and polishing them until they gleamed. All day they worked, not for customers and not for money, but out of love for the small helpers who had restored their future. The tiny clothes and shoes lay neatly on the workbench beneath the candle's warm glow. There were no leather pieces that night and no unfinished shoes waiting for invisible hands. Instead, the bench held shirts, coats, trousers, and polished little shoes, every piece made with care. The shoemaker and his wife put out the lamp and hid once more behind the curtain. Then they waited in the darkened workshop as midnight approached, hoping with quiet intensity that the elves would return. At midnight, the elves sprang onto the workbench and reached at once for the leather, ready to begin their familiar task. But there was no leather. In its place lay the tiny clothes and the tiny shoes. For a moment, they stood utterly still. Then they lifted the garments and held them up in the moonlight. They touched the soft cloth, turned the little coats around, and examined the shoes with shining eyes. Slowly, unmistakably, joy spread across their bright faces. The elves pulled on the tiny clothes and dressed themselves from head to foot. One slipped into a shirt and coat, while the other stepped into trousers and fastened the little buttons with delighted care. When they put on the tiny shoes, they tapped their feet on the bench, first cautiously and then with pride. They looked handsome and radiant, no longer cold and bare, but dressed like noble little folk from a hidden kingdom. Behind the curtain, the shoemaker and his wife watched through tears and smiles. The elves danced across the workbench, around the candle, and over the shoemaker's tools. They skipped across the floor, twirled beneath the chair, and leaped over a roll of leather with such pleasure that the whole room seemed brighter. The shoemaker and his wife could scarcely contain their happiness as they watched. At last, the elves danced toward the door. They turned once, as though offering thanks in their own wordless way, and then vanished into the winter night. The next morning, the shoemaker stood in the empty workshop beside his wife. The tiny clothes were gone, the little shoes were gone, and the elves did not return. For a moment, he wondered whether their good fortune had ended with that final dance. Then he looked around him. Good leather rested on the shelves, strong tools waited in their places, loyal customers trusted his hands, and his wife stood beside him. He understood then that the elves had given him more than finished shoes. They had given him a second chance. Years later, the shoemaker gave a pair of shoes to a poor child while his wife offered warmth and food nearby. He had continued to work honestly, shaping every pair with the care that had always guided him. Customers still came, drawn not only by his skill but also by the generosity behind it. He and his wife lived comfortably, with enough bread, firewood, leather, and peace. They never forgot the little helpers. Whenever they met someone struggling as they once had struggled, they found a way to help. The elves and the shoemaker closes with quiet warmth rather than triumph or grand reward. The elves do not remain, and the magic never becomes something the shoemaker can summon or control. Instead, their kindness gives him time, hope, and the chance to stand upright again. He and his wife answer not with greed, but with gratitude made practical and loving. Then they carry that same kindness outward, helping others when they can. For language learners, the story holds clear and lasting ideas. Careful work has value, help may arrive from unexpected places, and generosity grows stronger when it is passed on. On winter nights, we can still imagine the tiny dance in the moonlit shop, bright with the joy of giving and being remembered. You can find the learning materials for this story, along with many more stories, on our website at lingotales.app. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and share it with others. And if Lingotales is helpful for your learning journey, consider subscribing so you can stay connected with our latest videos. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.